Hello and welcome to Assessment in Focus, the podcast where we invite guests to tell us the real stories of digital assessment transformation, innovation and enhancement. Flexible assessment with integrity is a shared goal between higher education and Inspira, and normally we're here to discover how institutions around the world are assessing today and beyond, but today I have a special guest in the shape of Ryan Lufkin. I'm Ishan Kolhatkar, your host and global client evangelist at Inspira, and I am beyond delighted to welcome Ryan to the podcast. Ryan, thanks very much for coming on.
John, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So a little bit about Ryan. He is the Vice President of Global Academic Strategy at Instructure, where he works to enhance the academic experience for educators and learners worldwide. With over 2 decades in the EdTech world, Ryan has experience with every major technology platform that institutions use to deliver education, from the LMS, Instructure, to the SIS and all the systems in between. Ryan is a well-known thought leader in the EdTech industry, and I can tell you, if you get a chance to hear him speak, please take it with both hands. And more worryingly for me, he's a podcast co-host and frequent media spokesperson at industry conferences, events, webinars, so I feel like I'm going to be slightly judged on my podcast performance.
Not at all. You already know when we met in Barcelona, I was like, wow, you give a heck of a presentation, so you have nothing to fear.
That's tremendously kind of you. Let's see if we feel the same at the end of the podcast. So, Ryan, it's a really exciting time to be involved in EdTech, and I use that in a measured way because there's lots of opportunity, but I think as we look through our questions today, there are areas of dispute, differing opinions, a myriad of views out there in academia, though I think we can probably both say that that's true all the time anyway.
Yeah.
The topics just change.
Yeah, and honestly it is. I like to say it's the most transformative time in the history of education, going back to the printing press. And it really is. I mean, we've seen innovation like the calculator that we're met with consternation and concern, right? The internet, Wikipedia, right? We've seen these cycles. AI brings a new level of disruption to the game, but I actually think if we move beyond the fear and we embrace AI and that approach, honestly, there's so many opportunities that it creates in addition to the challenges. We just need to go in with our eyes open and really open to that evolution.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that we will explore some of those points that people are looking at. And I think there's also a space for some people who'll say, having considered this and looked at all of the options, it's maybe not for me, but that's fine because it's a considered view.
Yeah, this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all answer. It's not a silver bullet, right? We will end up, just like education today, we'll end up with people across the spectrum.
Absolutely. And I think it rolls us really nicely into the first question, which is about the role of technology in education, and one that log on to any platform and you can see debate about it. How do you see the role of education technology evolving over the next 5 or 10 years? And what do you think institutions should be doing now to prepare for the way that evolution is going to take place?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's something that Melissa Lowell, who's our chief academic officer, and I spend a lot of time talking about. And we have a very clear viewpoint that the spark of learning really is the connection between the teacher and the student. Technology doesn't replace that. Technology literally is just a scaffolding to support that and to scale that to more students, right? And so as schools are looking at technologies and identifying the technologies they want to use, they need to look at technologies that are evolving quickly, that are open, that align to common standards, right? That don't attempt to do everything or don't try to create a walled garden with their technology, but actually give them an ecosystem that they can plug into. I say that because I love working with Instructure and Canvas, because Canvas was designed from the start to be open, but fundamentally, we as a company are open, and those considerations matter, right? Because it means that we open new APIs as AI has come out so that you can plug in additional tools. We comply to the LTI standard so that you can plug in any other technology with an LTI app. We have Canvas Data 2 that allows you to export all of your data as holistically as possible, right? And that openness, it matters, because when you have partners that have that openness approach, they continue that. And whether you use Canvas and Instructure or any other, that should be the first thing you look for, is that openness, that understanding that the school, the institution, it's their data. It's not the tech partner's data. It's, if anything, it might, we're having conversations around it. It is probably at some level the student's data, right? And what rights to that data do they have, right? So making sure that you've got people with that perspective, because that's what is going to allow for growth and expansion and evolution over time.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think of Inspira Originality, our similarity checker, at the heart of that is that the data is not ours, as you say, belongs to the institution. If they want to devolve that down to the student, they can. And I'm completely with you on that openness, because I've certainly seen, when talking to educators, and I know we talked about this in Barcelona, one of the things that we share is that opportunity to spend time talking to educators.
Yeah, honestly, I tell people I have the best job in the world, and you do too. But right, but the idea that I get to go out and talk to educators, to administrators, the people that are actually facing the challenges but shaping education on a daily basis. I was in Florida the beginning of the week at University of Florida's AI conference, and it was one of those where I wasn't presenting. I just got to sit in the audience and absorb, and it's fascinating. I walk away with pages and pages of notes and links, and that experience is incredible. And again, that's part of that openness, right? I never claim to be the smartest person in the room. I say, even on our podcast, I'm like, this is a great podcast because we have the smartest people in the world that come on to make us smarter and make you smarter, right?
But this is why I had you on. It's important to get those perspectives.
Yeah.
And that openness in terms of dialogue, as you say, also where I've worked here for a number of years. I was an Inspira user before I was a member of staff here. But ultimately, people care about what it's doing. I mean, the branding, the names, these are all lovely things, and we'd like people to use Canvas and Inspira, but they care about the data, they care about the process, they care about the outcomes it creates. And you're right, it's so important that we don't lose sight of that in letting people use their data and letting them use what they've got. So with that in mind, how do institutions make sure either that they continue to operate in a way that allows them to take advantage of this, or if they're perhaps saying to themselves, we're not doing that well enough, what should they be doing to make sure that they can take best advantage of openness in academia, which stays, but openness in the industry too?
It's interesting because when Melissa Lobel came on board as our chief academic officer, she and I sat down and we created what we call the Impactful 8. And there are these 8 themes that are most impacting education. I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them is optimization of the tools that you have, right? Post-COVID, a lot of institutions signed up for a lot of technologies, and some of those were being used very effectively, and some of those weren't. And then we've really been in the phase the last year or two of institutions looking at the solutions they're using and making sure that they're either using them to their fullest or maybe get rid of them, right? And let's spend those dollars in new technologies and things like that. So having that focus on efficiency is really important, but also being open to new technologies, right? One of the challenges, and we talk a lot about AI, you and I have had these conversations, but it's one of those things where we've been in this fear mode, right? We were all conditioned to fear AI because of the 1980s movies, Terminator, war games. And so when it came, we were obviously scared of it. And the first couple of years of this Gen AI revolution since November of 22 really have been spent getting over that fear, and it's funny because now we look back and go, oh, there was this, a knee-jerk reaction to ban AI on campus. And now that's kind of unheard of. We know it's being used. It's going to be used. Now it's like, how do we set the guardrails? How do we teach AI literacy? How do we teach effectiveness? And so being open to that evolution, I think if you're still of the mindset that you're not going to use AI or you're not going to use technology, you're really failing the students, right? Whether or not you believe your mission is to train students for jobs or to train students to be better members of society, both of those involve embracing this technology because it's going to be so intrinsic to our lives moving forward. It's unrealistic to kind of bury your head in the sand and pretend that it's not. And so yeah, so I think whether it's learning technology, whether it's institutions, we need to be looking at, and again, measuring the concerns, student privacy, IP, copyright. Like there's plenty of concerns to be cognizant of. But if we look at the evolution and the change and what does it look like for students and for members of our society in the next 5 to 10 years, we've got to embrace these changes.
I agree with you, and that does not equal zealotry of
Exactly.
AI.
Yeah. I mean, you're spot on with that because I think making sure that we are defining the challenges, being aware of the challenges, and doing our job, which is to protect students and our educators and their data and their right to privacy and things like that. We've got to be aware of those. Zealotry goes too far, and then that opens.
It does, and so does probably my use of the word zealotry. But yeah, it's taking this idea that they're saying absolutely to everything or absolutely not, that neither of those are the answer. Because you might come to the conclusion that on this assessment or in my module or on this program, there isn't a space for AI. That might be tenable based on the discussions you've had, but you're right that it does not mean that you are able to leave the teaching of AI completely
Exactly.
out of
Yeah.
where you are, because your students need that.
Yeah, and a lot of institutions are defining really clear frameworks around, and even visual identification markers that say this course is a non-AI course, or this course is a, partial AI course. They've defined their criteria, and then as long as you're communicating that to students, what does that mean? Students are hungry for that kind of guidance. And I'll tell you, I've got a college student. She's a sophomore at the University of Utah, and I have a son who's in junior high school, the 8th grade here in Salt Lake City. And to see the difference in how their educators are approaching AI is really kind of striking. And unfortunately, I think in primary school, a lot of educators are still very much focused on the academic integrity aspect of it, and they're not providing the guidance. And I will tell you, these students are tech native, and they're using it whether you tell them no or not. And so, but then, my daughter at the University of Utah, she's very clearly being given guidance on when to use it, how to use it, course by course, right? And they need that type of guidance. They're hungry for it. And so, we as educators need to pick up the mantle of actually, creating those guardrails, being very clear with our communication around it, because we can't blame students. Again, my son doesn't understand why I can use Grammarly or I can use spell check, but I can't use AI. For them, it's just another technology at their fingertips.
Completely, and it's give me an in to talk about my children. I'll talk about my eldest for a moment, which is I was showing the other day that one of the skills that I think that I have is the ability to write formulae in Excel or in Sheets. The skill's gone because if you describe it well enough, AI will answer that for you, and it'll do it quicker, and it'll get it right. So I was showing my eldest the difference between a spreadsheet I was building, where I didn't put in any of my data, I just gave it the references to create me a formula. Look, good, clear answer. I then got it to generate some text and said, you know that that's wrong. But I think we need to be showing people that, because otherwise the intrigue that's there isn't the guardrail, there isn't the explanation. I would love to see lecturers saying, okay, let's take our problem question and put it into AI, and I can show you what's right and what's wrong, so that you can see that just putting this into AI is
It's not the answer. You're
not the answer.
Yeah, and the issue is AI literacy. That's why AI literacy. I speak a lot about AI literacy specifically because one of the third step in the 4-step like AI literacy process is teaching that skepticism, right? That critical thinking around the answers, because they're not always right. And I will push back on you on one thing: the same thing that makes you a really good writer will make you a really good prompt writer. And the better you are at prompt writing, the better nuanced content you can get. Like you've used the tools. The basic response from ChatGPT in writing things is pretty good. It's often be called B+ work, right? But if you really want A+ work, or that innovative work, you have to really spend the time writing very detailed prompts, creating the context, giving it additional information, even giving it tone and background writing samples of yours. Like, to really get good, you've got to be good. And I think that's what's lost is people seem to think that you can just type whatever in and it'll read my mind and spit out what I want. And that's just not the case. And so teaching critical thinking around the responses, teaching really good prompt writing, these are all parts of AI literacy that only benefit, the society as a whole, but really they benefit the students as well.
Completely. They're all tech tools. I mean,
Yeah.
autocorrect has a limit.
Yeah.
I said
Yeah.
things where it's looked at me and said, I have no idea.
I've done the same thing, and I'm actually I'm like, I know it's spelled something like that. You gotta be getting this, right? Yeah.
But it doesn't do magic. We both know the importance of pedagogy before technology, that the pedagogy has to come first. So AI is a particular trend. We've had others. You've named probably all of the trends over the last at least 20 years, probably going back further. How do institutions ensure that innovation aligns with sound pedagogy rather than just being driven by a trend?
Some schools are doing it very well, and they're really training that pedagogy first motion, right? And helping educators understand where technology, not just AI, but technology in general, supports pedagogy, scales pedagogy. And what I think is interesting is we've seen some schools that are very hands-off in training, and I think that's the wrong approach. I think, just like adoption of technology 5 years ago, pre-COVID, right? It was all over the board, and we had educators who were simply, I'm not going to use technology to teach my course because it's distracting or it's detrimental, or I'm simply not going to do it. And we saw some of those people when we moved to fully online during COVID actually being furloughed because of they were so resistant to it. And the silver lining we often talk about of COVID is that we took a jump forward. Now really all technology should be in technology, or all learning should be technology enriched learning, right? This is where we meet our students. They're digitally native. They're on their phones. They're on their computers. Even old folks like me, right? I'm constantly on my phone or my digital device. If you tried to, send me packets in the mail or, make me show up every day for a class, I'd really struggle to do that. And, I look at my daughter and she's living on campus at the University of Utah, and she's still taking a mix of in-person online courses because that's what fits with her schedule. And so we've got to meet that flexibility, and we really need to again, provide educators the professional development and the tools they need. We can't just assume that they know how to teach with technology. We can't just assume that they know what a good online course or a good hybrid course looks like. We need to model what good looks like, train them on it, and provide them those tools. And, we see lots of schools using Canvas to teach your educators on how to teach in Canvas, right? That makes a lot of sense. We at Instructure do all of our professional development in Canvas because then we're in the products, and sometimes we go, oh, we could do that better. Why haven't we fixed that? Things like that. But I think the other aspect, the other silver lining that has come out of COVID that I always like to point out is a focus on the user experience. What does it look like for a student moving between courses in different programs, things like that? And the days of, academic integrity used to mean, or academic freedom used to mean, use whatever LMS you want. Man, the user experience for a student navigating between 3 different LMSs that look nothing alike and have different, that's crazy. We would never consider doing that today. And so I think we need to kind of learn from some of those past experiences and really think, okay, in the future, what does the experience look like for my educators designing and delivering these courses? But what is the end result? What does the student experience look like? And map to that. I think that's incredibly important. And we only do that through professional development and guidance to educators.
People, and I'm sure that, certainly I've seen it firsthand in previous roles that I've had, that educators are very open to finding out how the technology works, but also very, very open to, as you know, my background is I was a lawyer and I was an educator. 2 groups who are not quiet about telling you what they like and don't like, which is great. And legal educators are a confluence of the two. But if you show people how to use technology, you do get, obviously, the opportunity to teach them how to be better at something, but you get amazing feedback. And it doesn't have to be from someone who is at the cutting edge of technology.
Absolutely,
it's someone
yeah.
who says, this is what I'm going to use, right, let me tell you what's great and what isn't. That's the kind of feedback that's golden,
Yeah.
which I think we sometimes miss out on.
No, and there was some great Titan Partners research from 2 years ago that said, educators that had just used the tool, used the free version of ChatGPT, used the free version of Microsoft Copilot, just go out and experiment with it, had a substantially higher view of AI in the classroom than the ones who hadn't, because there was almost a wall there. I'm not going to use it. I don't like it. And that still exists with a lot of these educators. Simply going in helps you understand what they're good at, but it also helps you understand what they're not good at, and it makes you realize they're not a silver bullet. They're not threatening your job. You, the educator, are the spark, the guide. We walk around with a supercomputer in our pocket with all of the world's information, and we still need teachers. We still need librarians. We still need these guides, and we always will. And so I think when you embrace that and say, I can just share my love of teaching with more students in a more engaging way by using these technologies, I think that's when you move forward really productively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know there's this concern of, okay, but unfettered access to AI, and I'm just going to get AI answers to my questions. I think there's an extent to which, yeah, that's true, and we are going to have to work out what our response to that is. If it is that's all we've got, sure, we've got choices of either putting people back into rooms, which, as you say, doesn't necessarily fit with the experience that people want, of amending what we do. But it lets me ask my question that I'm actually asking everyone this year, because I like to have one thing that I ask everyone so that there's a nice white paper at the end of the year, which is about the future of assessment. I know this is a bit more in Spira world and a part of the wider Instructure world. I do promise you and other people listening that I have some more questions about learning more generally. So here's my assessment one. How do you see digital assessment changing the way we measure students' learning? And what challenges still need to be addressed? What's the future in this space really look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of people fear that the future is AI writing papers that are then graded by AI, and we create a loop where learning isn't involved, right? And I think what's really important, and the mission I always say is, we need to make sure AI is being used to enhance learning, not detract from learning, and or not to avoid learning, right? That's really the piece. If we're using AI to avoid learning, we're doing something wrong. We're also probably not doing assessment in the way we should, right? Assessments evolve. We're the state of Utah here in the U.S. moved to a mastery based grading model, right? Which is actually much, when you understand it, is much more effective. Unfortunately, they didn't do a great job of explaining to parents beforehand what they were doing, or training parents on it. And so when it came out, they had a lot of very concerned parents. Why is my child not getting a 4? You were like, well, we just started the class. Of course they wouldn't have a 4, right? But I want my student to have a 4, right? And so there's education around this evolution that we need to do to make sure that as we shift towards the mastery of skill, measuring the mastery of skill, we bring people who are more accustomed to the more traditional grading models, assessment models along. And then the other aspect too is when you there's two levels here. One is one of the first webinars I did in January of 2023. I had an educator on who said, my son is neurodivergent, and he has always struggled with understanding the reasons for doing an assignment unless the why behind the assignment is explained. And it was kind of a reflective moment for me, because I thought, you know what? How many times have we gotten an assignment, a piece of homework, and we just really didn't understand why we were doing it? It wasn't articulated. And I think that's what's really important in the age of AI, to explain the why. And when you explain the why, you explain why it's detrimental to use AI as part of this process, because you're not fundamentally learning that thing that I'm trying to teach you. And so being a little bit more descriptive, being a little bit more, providing more explanation on the why behind things is incredibly important. But then also changing up our assessment methods so that, kind of going back to a little bit more of the Socratic model, right? One of the things that's interesting is you're like, well, the Socratic model is like 1-to-1. How do you scale that? Awesome thing about AI is both the cause of the problem and the solution to the problem, right? Suddenly we can actually use AI to help scale us in ways we never could have done before. Competency-based education is suddenly possible at scale in much more powerful ways. There's when we really start thinking creatively, we can use AI to solve the very problems it's created, but we've got to be open to that evolution and to doing things differently. And actually, when you really get into it, I've talked to educators who actually get really excited and be like, you know what? We've been doing it kind of a lazy way for a long time, and this actually gives us a reason to be a little more innovative, a little more creative, and there's something exciting about that for educators.
There is. It's what struck me as you were answering that is that it's another example of the sorts of things that we all want to be doing and that we think are good in education, just put through a different lens. So, assessment literacy, uh, the explanation of assessments from a personal perspective, the program of study that I enjoyed the most was the bar exams, which in this country are very different. We have a unique set of bar exams in that uh, I'd say like 80% of it, 85% of it is practical. So you do practical assessments. That I enjoy because I that's my nature rather than sitting and writing. So doing these things by showing people why they're doing an assessment, how to do them better, how to their general assessment literacy is A, the path we're already on, B, not a bad thing in itself. Just AI is adding to that as one of the factors we should be looking at.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And I think using AI for the right things. There were a lot of people that were lamenting, like, well, I want to be the one drawing pictures and writing poems, and AI's. Well, those are kind of these weird simple things you can apply AI to. It's more complex when you start applying AI behind the scenes, right? But it can help you write a rubric. It can help you organize your course content. It can help create course content that instead of having it be text heavy, drop it in and have it be a video, have it be a song, right? Like there's so many different ways when we are open to it and thinking creatively that we can use these tools in ways that again allow us to then spend more time connecting with individual students and providing them the feedback. And that's what they want. They don't want AI providing feedback on their papers. They don't want AI, just generating the results. They understand that that is less valuable than that human connection with an educator. We need educators to understand that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that there's actually a space, as you say, for it to be used, or at least be considered in how it's used, to be additive to the overall experience that students have. The As we look at AI, as we consider the different ways that it could be used in education, are there any examples of where you think there is a really good use case here? And again, for our audience, for most people, perhaps, maybe not everyone, we're not saying it's universal, but examples of good use cases. You mentioned writing a rubric, yeah, and any others that you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's things tools that we've rolled out in Canvas like translation in emails and in discussions, right? Discussion summaries, where that's one challenge where if an educator needs to review a discussion. If they've got hundreds of posts on a discussion, that can be really time consuming to go through. So clicking a button and be able to understand what the discussion is covering, right, is incredibly helpful. Those little time savers are huge. But the one area that I think has the most potential that we're just kind of scratching the surface of now is personalized learning. And we all know that like they're not every teacher teaches the same way, and not every learner learns the same way. And sometimes we end up with gaps in that connection between a teacher and a student. If we can use AI to fill those gaps, maybe I'm a more visual learner. I need more images, more graphs, more charts, right? If there's setting in my tool where I could actually say, hey, I need this, you could actually set it based off of your learning preferences. That really ends up transforming a course without increasing the workload of the educator, but providing additional engagement to me and keeping me on track. Those can have big changes, right, or big impacts for relatively small changes and relatively small impact. And so I think that personalized learning piece, scaling educators' time, is huge. But then I think all of the whatever we can do on the back end to make educators' lives easier, initial pass review of papers, things like that, where it'll go through and say, hey, okay, did they do everything assigned in the rubric? Now let me go through and say I'm gonna focus on the key areas I want to provide feedback on, things like that, right? Always human in the loop, but really giving educators back more time. That's, I think, at least at this phase, that's really the focus.
I that resonates hard with me, particularly because anyone who's met me knows that I have absolutely no design skills whatsoever. So when it comes to making a picture or a nice slide, you're talking to the wrong person. I can talk about it, but I certainly can't design it. Let's think about the people listening who are thinking, "Hey, that sounds great," but I'm worried about what the AI will do. I am worried about how much of that becomes the AI rather than me. how do what's our message to people who might be thinking, but this is, this is not me. This is diminishing what I do, not adding.
That's it's interesting because I think the when you really go in and look at you start using these tools, and again, like I said, they're not the magic bullet. They are not teaching your course for you. They're not. They can help you create scenarios. They can help you really refresh the content. A lot of us, if you've taught for any period of time, you're repeating your course from semester to semester. You can actually just go through and have AI help you do a refresh on it. It's your content that's just going to help you, create different scenarios and different assignments and things like that. The biggest piece too, and I think we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, is there are real concerns around intellectual property for educators and schools. There's real data concerns about student data privacy, and what most colleges and universities and school districts and organizations are doing is working with a preferred partner, right? You've got things like University of Michigan standing up their own ChatGPT. ASU's doing the same thing. University of Florida has created their own environment. There's so many examples of standing up your own siloed version of these tools so that as you're using them, they're firewalled from the larger AI models, right? They're simply not consuming that data and then sharing it out. They're not being trained off that data. That's really important, and understanding how to evaluate that and make sure you're using the right tools is really key. What's interesting though is University of Michigan told a great story in one of our calls where they stood up Maisie, their own ChatGPT, and they rolled it out to students. They were like, "Ta-da! Now use this instead of public-facing ChatGPT." And students were like, "No, we don't trust you," and because they were like, we think you're monitoring what the outputs are and seeing if we're cheating, and they were like, "No, we're not," like but they hadn't thought about that, and so making sure you've got those stakeholders in the decisions, and as you roll it out, you've got students in that process. That's really key. But working with across your institution to define those safe spaces, those safe AIs, and just, again, being basically aware of how they work and what the risks are really solves a lot of problems, because then you say, oh, I'm not going to put my manuscript for my novel in this public facing ChatGPT tool because it will be absorbed and trained on that tool. Now suddenly the model has all that and it's no longer protectable, right? As a lawyer, there's lots of copyright concerns I'm sure you're aware of that are happening, and so again, there's so many great basic courses out there on these tools. I just did the Google AI Essentials free course to see how they were teaching it, right, and see what they were doing, and things like that are just a great introduction to the risks and the possibilities for educators that may feel like they've missed the boat. It feels like there's so much and it's moving so fast. I think a lot of people are saying, well, I missed the boat. I just now I got to sit on the sidelines. And I assure you, go out and take this AI Essentials course. Go out and find a free course. There's so many institutions that offer free courses. University of Michigan offers a free course for K-12 educators on how to teach using AI in Canvas with Canvas, right? Just go out and look for these free courses. So many universities offer them. And that's an intro into feeling like you're not being left behind. And you'll be surprised how rapidly you can come up to speed. And you don't have to monitor this. This doesn't have to become a second job. But just understanding how the tools work really does put you in a better space. And frankly, it sets you up better to be able to help your students in ways that they need.
Yeah, particularly if we give educators the ability to decide what they're going to use. I mean, one of our principles is we create technology for people to use, institutions choose what they're going to use, and then where possible, we want them to give the educator final say about what they're doing. If we take this idea that one of the things you can do with AI is refresh material, I used to write briefs that people would have to use, and I quickly realized that I had no skill whatsoever in writing people's names. So what would happen is I would take two friends and take one first name and one second name, put them together. So I then listened to students sort of mangle friends' names as they said things. Now, look, that's just one end of the scale. And
It's a
someone
silly
like
little one, but it's one of those things that how much time did you waste trying to think of names?
a
And
lot,
you could literally go to ChatGPT and give me a random ethnically diverse list of first names and last names, and it
precisely.
would provide you an amazing set to work with.
And if we said to people, you know what, that's if you want to use AI and just use that, that's fine. I think we've got to get away from this idea that AI is a massive flip of the switch, which
Yes.
means you're either using nothing
Yeah.
or you have to use
Yeah.
every tool in every scenario. You don't.
Yes.
It's the same
I
with
love that point.
all the suite of applications you have in your desktop.
That's incredibly important because you can use it for simple things like, you know, summarizing large emails. He does that really amazingly well. Summarizing large documents, writing basic, have it write your out of office email, right? Something unimportant like that, and you'll be surprised. And you say, now make it funny. Now make it right, like, and just play with it that way, and you'll be surprised how good it is. But it's not all or nothing, and you're spot on with that because I think too many people think that you have to dive in completely, and in reality, you can dip your toe in and just start using it a little bit, and you'll be surprised at how much you start finding little ways to use it productively.
Sure. Or again, as we said at the start, or maybe you won't, and that's
Or
fine.
maybe not.
You've tried
Yeah,
it and you've seen it and you've
yeah.
come up with a decision.
But at least it's not based on fear. Your decision is based on knowledge, and that is so much better than a decision based on fear that is ill informed. Right? Gain that knowledge, understand it, so that you can answer questions on why you decided not to use it. Right?
That's exactly what people need to be doing. One of the other things that education provides us is tons of data, loads and loads of data, and there's an insatiable appetite for data. I wanted to ask you a question as someone who you generate all the data. You don't. Instructure generates a lot of data for to Ryan with a crank handle somewhere. No, Instructure generates a lot of data for the myriad of institutions worldwide that uses Instructure and uses Instructure products and Canvas as an LMS and Parchment and all the other parts of the toolkit within Instructure. How do educators use this data effectively without overwhelming themselves or their students? I've seen big data sets, but then people saying, "I'm not quite sure where I go next with this. What's useful to me?"
Well, what's interesting is that's one of those other silver linings of the pandemic, right? Is part of the pandemic, any conversation of data usage was met with, oh, you're going to use it punitively, your big brother, right? And because we all moved online and we had to use data as a really as one of our senses to be able to understand how students were doing, we really advanced pretty aggressively as an industry in education around using data effectively. And to be clear, we're the pass through, right? It's not our data. We capture the data that the school wants to capture and pull that together in ways and then give it back to the institution. We're not aggregating large data sets. But a lot of schools are really looking at, okay, how do I take my data from the LMS, from the SIS, from these different tools that we're using, and bring that together in really constructive ways. And before, you used to have conversations around big data, data lakes, dump it all in there and we'll figure it out. And now we're talking about much more structured data and how do we actually use this in really effective ways. And in Canvas, we rolled out a tool called Intelligent Insights, which is a step beyond just the basic course analytics that we provide, which are really great insights for educators into how students in their courses are doing. This is kind of a next level. It lets educators very simply, actually using AI, write queries, type in, I would like to understand this, right? What's cool is it shows you the SQL query that is generating. So then you can, if you do know code, you can go in and modify the SQL query. But for educators that are not super deep tech savvy, this is a really incredible way to actually get insights from that data. And more you're going to see that whether it's your school itself using BI tools to pull that data together and pull reports. But the days really of having to request a report from your administrators, then waiting 2 months or 3 months, that's not actionable at that point, right? You want to make sure that you're getting this data in a timely fashion. And most institutions really are striving to figure out how do we get that in the teacher's hands, in the provost's hands, so they can actually make informed decisions about courses, but programs, and look at students across the organization. So that's something that we're trying everything we can to facilitate and really provide that pass-through of data, but then also provide some of those tools that will help individual educators as well.
Yeah, I think, and that's the individual educator again, who just needs that
Yeah.
insight into it. And sometimes that first tool that you use is a hook into saying, okay, right, if you can get that and that, now
Yeah.
let me go ask someone about this next one.
Exactly.
This
Yes. That's a great point. Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
100%. And it's not until you start diving in that you kind of look at these different dimensions that you're like, I could dig that a little deeper there, right? And get a little more insight there. And I think as educators, we're naturally inquisitive that way. Like we want to start understanding that. So, being given access to data in a way that we haven't actually had before is really pretty exciting.
This question is huge, and I don't pretend for you or for the audience that we can solve it in one question on a podcast. But it is absolutely worthy of discussion that as we rightly in education broaden what we consider as the various points of equity, diversity, access, all of the things that might be inhibitors to learning, what role can and should technology companies be playing in helping institutions break down those barriers, enable their students, and have that parity or equality or equity, depending on which measure is the right one for you for a particular scenario, for your students?
That is a huge question.
Yes.
But it is interesting because I think that's something where when we started developing AI features, we set up very 3 criteria: intentional, right? We're going to solve real human problems. Safe, we're gonna meet the guidelines around safety, privacy, accessibility that we've always had, and then equitable, right? We are going to be very cognizant about not creating gaps in accessibility for these tools between the haves and the have-nots. And you might say, okay, well, the free version of ChatGPT is trained on 350 billion parameters. That's pretty powerful. Well, the paid version is trained on 1.7 trillion and is much less likely to hallucinate or provide confidently incorrect answers, right? So there is a discrepancy there. So how do we leverage the tools that are bringing the same level of output, the same level of skill, right? That kind of stuff. How do we make sure we're not, again, creating the haves versus the have-nots? The other aspect too is something that came a little bit late to the game was cost, right? These tools can be very expensive at scale because they pass a lot of data back and forth. And so one of the things that we're working with specifically, we're hosted on AWS. Canvas was actually built with AWS as a partner from the very beginning. And so we leverage a lot of their tools and their functions. And one of the things we're working on with AWS is shrinking the large language models that we use, right? They have seven bedrock large language models that are Llama and Claude and all of those hosted within AWS. But now we're starting to look at micro versions and nano versions of those. How can we scale these back so that they're trained on enough parameters to be effective at their tasks, but they're designed for specific tasks? And how much does that reduce the cost, both environmental and financial, so that we're not driving up the cost of these tools? We're not having out of bounds. The environmental cost is something that I've actually gotten asked a lot internationally. When I was in Latin America, multiple times they brought that up in concerns, and every query that you write in ChatGPT creates 4.32 grams of carbon, right? It doesn't seem like a lot until you realize that there's 10 million queries a day in ChatGPT alone. That's not all of the other models. That scales really fast to have a major environmental impact for all that data usage. And so how do we become stewards on behalf of our institutions for shrinking that and really bringing that down? And that's something that Zach Pendleton, who's our chief architect, spends a lot of time with Mary Strain and some of the folks over at AWS to really look at what does that look like and how do we scale that. You've got to make sure that you are, again, as you choose vendors, you look at these tools, that should be a question you ask. And if they're simply using the latest and greatest and the most powerful models, that's a little bit like, killing a fly with a battleship, right? Like, for most of what we do, we don't need something trained on 1.7 trillion parameters. We need something that knows that specific topic of our course really well and can act as a teaching assistant or act as it can, set up a scenario. Khan Academy did a really interesting thing where you could talk to Socrates, or you could speak with Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, right, and have a back and forth conversation because that tool was trained on them. You don't need quantum computing level AI to achieve those. So how do we work together to optimize that?
Absolutely. Context is key. Whether we're talking about AI or teaching generally, the context is so important. And likewise, we're using AWS and looking at Bedrock and how, as you say, there's so many things wrapped in there about the size of the LLM, the context of the LLM. Well, that looks at the academic integrity issues potentially. It looks at the appropriateness of the outputs. And certainly the answer to this, whether it's the equity of access, whether it's the environmental cost, whether it's academic integrity, unfettered access and untrammeled access and uneducated access to AI is definitely not the answer here.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's
Well, even the bias piece. You mentioned bias there, right? We still see major bias in the outputs of these tools, even though schools like UCLA are actively working on training their AI models against bias, or using it to even identify bias in other large language models, things like that. And there's little tools. We've got a little tool that we just did a beta test with that actually, in our discussion posts, will actually flag language and say, hey, you're using gender biased language. Hey, did you know that some of the language might be deemed offensive, right? Yeah. Things like that just helps people in the moment before they hit send on that post. Yeah. Maybe think about what they're posting. And I think, in the world we live in today, a little bit of civility and a little bit of cognizance around the language we use goes a long way.
My teaching philosophy when I had to write it for my postgraduate course was that every word matters.
It does, yeah, I love that.
Personal philosophy.
Yeah.
And for listeners, particularly those who know me, I don't profess to always get it right. But being reminded whether it's your own voice, someone else's to help you, that's a great use.
It's funny. Like my family motto is just within my family is communication solves all problems, right? And so that idea that every word matters just layers on top of that. I love it.
By contrast, some people just think that means I'm a pedant about every word that I use, and there's probably a tiny bit of truth in that. This is more about the fact that, words have meanings, have several meanings. Put them together, and you start to increase those combinations. I can see a potential use for essentially a co-pilot on presentations. How's this going to land? Who's this going to appeal to? How might someone get this?
Yeah.
Especially
across cultures. I mean, you and I both travel, to Europe, to Latin America, to Asia, and there are times when I've got great people on my team in the Philippines, for instance, who will say, "Hey, when you talk about this, really be cognizant." And like that's so helpful in a way. If you just had somebody in your pocket helping you do those things too, right? That's much more scalable.
It is much more scalable and incredibly useful to us. As we come towards the end of our time, and I promise you, I could go on for hours.
This is a great conversation. I really could, yeah.
I've been there with Inspira before I worked here, where I was installing it. I was implementing it across an institution and getting people enthused about it. And then COVID came along and it gave it a little boost because we had to, there's programs that had to use it. Change is hard. Change is hard for everybody. Looking at your experiences across ed tech, what are the one or two things that really help with that change process, that really help institutions to solve the problem that we've all had, we'll all continue to have, but we can't extinguish them, we just need to find better ways of working with them?
Yeah. It's interesting because that, we were just talking about my family motto, the communication solves all problems. And actually, I think one of the things that's been really interesting that I've noticed is, and there was actually some data that came out, and I think it was a Boston Consulting Group research last year, but the number of institutions that said, hey, we've released great resources for all of our educators around AI was like 60%, maybe 70%. Educators saying, educators that were aware of that content and were using it was down at like 20%, right? And so we're really good sometimes at staying in our lane and building these tools to help educators. We're not always great at marketing it and communicating it out. And so I think we need to take away, kind of step back from our assumptions and the fact that everyone knows as much as we do, right? even this podcast, we're engaged in a conversation with probably the top 10% of people within the education space, and that's not to be elitist. That's to be aware that our perspective is not shared by a great number of people, and we need to make sure that we do our best to share that perspective and help them understand whether they really want to use AI and can find a way to use it or not. Just making them smart, making sure they understand the resources that are available, making sure that they haven't missed the boat. That communication, that professional development is key. And I think patience, right? I think these tools are relatively easy to use once you dive into them. But people have different tech levels. People have different trust issues around technology, right? We need to make sure that we're being understanding with how we roll these out, and the policies aren't. I think at the very beginning you said this. You were very clear. This is not one size fits all, and I think that's important. There's just nuanced ways, different ways. People have their preferences and the different tools they want to use and how they want to use it, and we need to be flexible in that as well and provide as much support and flexibility across organizations and not make assumptions about what people know or don't know. Start with, let's provide the basics and then move up from there. And I think that's what sets us up to be effective and really brings everyone along across the organization.
Yep, and I think to looking at that too, it's the best way of finding out what people don't like, where they think you're wrong.
Oh yes,
again, they'll tell you, and they'll tell you loudly.
And the earlier in the process you find out, the better off you are. There's nothing worse than the ta-da, boo moment, right? Like we've got to make sure that as we do those ta-das, everybody's standing with us and everybody is on board with what we want to roll out and what our approach is. Again, it's really hard to. Sometimes people call it herding cats to get everybody on the same page, right? There's always going to be dissenters. But if you can bring in the key stakeholders, make sure people feel like they've got a voice, that goes a really long way. And just being heard, I think, is really important. And as we make these decisions and evolve.
One of my other children now gets a mention because really wanted meatballs. I love cooking, it's my hobby. Really, really wanted meatballs. And I had the ta-da moment and we realised he was talking Italian meatballs. I was thinking more Spanish meatballs. I've got the herbs and spices completely wrong, but an early bit of miscommunication. Now, I can say I delivered meatballs. He can say I asked for meatballs. We were not aligned.
That's a great analogy. Yes, that is.
Know which kind of meatballs you're making.
Yeah, and I think that's especially in an area where there's new terminology. There's no, people don't fundamentally understand what a large language model is, right? And just explaining that it's a bit of a black box. It's even the term AI. A lot of people they'll throw out AI and they're talking about really machine learning and the early kind of fundamental piece, right? Like, so just making sure you're speaking the same language. Yeah, big deal.
Hey, while we're here, I'm going to say I don't really agree with the word hallucination. I think it's trying to put a soft edge on it.
Oh, I had a great. Her name is escaping me. She's from MIT, and she was on a podcast, and she just kind of went off about. She does not like it. It is anthropomorphizing a tool. It's not really hallucination. It's just giving nonsensical answers, right? So let's call it what it is. She didn't use nonsense. She used a more profane term, but like essentially that's what it is. It's and the other aspect too of that is understanding that these things are not sentient. This is really important. They're not sentient. They won't be for at least the next 10 years. But like ascribing human attributes to them is wrong, right? When you ask for something, they're trying to give you what you want. If they make up a reference, if they make up something, they're doing so in service of you and trying to get what you want. And in many cases, that's because you haven't provided clear enough guidance to them. And the more clear you can be with them, the better that result is. And so I think, your analogy is great. The communication piece is key, but also not anthropomorphizing or trying to turn these into what they're not, which is humans, right?
I'm coming to my last question, and it's about the roles that actually you and I play, but the large organizations that we work for play and the rest of the industry. Education is the bedrock of what is provided by institutions, small and large, around the world to improve people's lives, to improve student outcomes. It is hugely important to a number of people. We are providers of technology in that space. How do we have that respectful relationship between educators and technology to make sure that we're both doing the best of the things that we can do? Because I think we certainly play a role in education, but it's not the same role as the educator.
Yeah.
So how do we square that?
So I love this question, and one of the things I think that's so interesting is we got to understand this conversation isn't limited to education. There is a massive conversation around AI that is happening across the globe, and I've got some Tracy Weeks, who's a member of my team who does policy work both in the United States and across the globe. Simone Raviole, who's on our team in Europe and monitors what UNESCO and other organizations are doing there. I think what our role is to understand the role that the conversation that we're having at the education level and how that differs from that broader conversation, that larger conversation. I feel like we are vanguards of education. We're defenders of education, and our job really is to in some ways grab that shield and protect education from overstepping. Really, we've got to defend privacy and security. We've got to defend accessibility. We've got to defend, the equitable access to education. These are all things that I, my team, Melissa Lobel, who's our chief academic officer, hold very, strongly. And I think our role is to step into these conversations, whether they're, education centric or in the broader world, and understand the role we play as defending education, making sure that we are guiding and supporting smart adoption, intelligent adoption around these that help education, that don't dismantle education, that don't devalue education, but actually help make education more engaging, more accessible, deeper for students, so that, again, the impact that we have on students' lives from a standpoint, everything this impacts society as a whole. So how do we help students, gain AI literacy so that they can define deep fakes, so that they're less likely to manipulation in elections and things like that, right? This is kind of a cascading effect, but our job is to help education to kind of defend that the sanctity of what we do to some level. And I think we've talked about it before, but I think many of us, we take that job very seriously. And that's why I think communication with all the stakeholders across education is really important, and hearing from them, having these conversations is key to making sure we're going in the right direction.
I couldn't agree more. That communication, we've both shared our personal phrases. It's really at the heart of all of this. Well, that is it for our discussion today. Thank you, Ryan, so much for joining me on the podcast. It has been really enlightening to hear your perspective, the broader perspective of what's happening in education. The examples that you've given us from your conversations are ones I know will be valuable to our listeners. And thank you to our listeners. If you found this useful, please like, subscribe and share via your preferred podcast platform. And if you've got a minute, a quick review would always be welcome. Ryan, aside from the fact that you have a podcast, is there anything else that you'd like to promote while you're
Melissa Lobel and I host the EduCast 3000 podcast, where, very similar to this, we talk about a lot of those 8 trends in education, the impactful 8, and have amazing guests on that just strive to make all of us a little bit smarter every day. And so I'd love to plug that. And, Ishan, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm sure we will cross paths. It'll probably be in Brazil or someplace strange. That's usually how it works.
Well, we're actually going to definitely cross paths in Spokane, in Washington,
yes,
at InstructureCon, one of several places I'm going this year, along with Lancaster here in England, to Hong Kong as well, a couple of others to be announced. I know that you and I are both thinking of wearing quite snazzy jackets.
We do like a little bit of the flair when it comes to our sport coats.
So we will see if the internet is ready for that picture. But this has been great. I'm so deeply appreciative. Assessment in Focus is brought to you by Inspiro, providing flexible assessment with integrity. I've been Ishan Kolhatkar, and I will see you next time.